Our first speaker for this morning is a friend of mine. I'll have to tease him just a tiny bit, and he knows that I like to tease. But Dr. Shetty is a genuine friend, and he is so diverse in what he does and so extremely knowledgeable, except when it comes to ice fishing, which, I like to tease folks so much, and I knew, being from another country, he probably never been ice fishing before. So, first thing we did is bought licenses, because, we must be law-abiding. And next thing we did is fire up the snowmobile, gather people up, and he brought a friend with as well, and off we went off onto the lake. Unfortunately, all we caught was just little teeny things, which kind of ruined my reputation, but regardless, everybody had a good time. So he is now an official ice fisher person. Okay, the rest of his bio is he's a founding director of the Global Institute of Food Security and International Agriculture and professor of plant science at North Dakota State University. He received his bachelor's degree from the University of Agricultural Science in Bangalore and a master's and PhD in microbiology from the University of Idaho. Dr. Shetty's research interests focus on the critical role of cellular and microbiologic basis of oxygen biology and microbiome interactions for advancing new innovations in food systems and health. He has published more than 200 manuscripts in peer-reviewed journals and holds 5 U.S. patents. So we are indeed lucky to have him. Help me welcome him.
Thank you, Linda, for the warm welcome. So I first like to take this opportunity to thank Linda and also Mindy for inviting me. I'm grateful that you have given me an opportunity to speak here. And so today's presentation, I'm going to cover 3 things. First of all, just a little bit, 4 things, just for a little bit background about myself beyond just the CV. And then some fundamentals of really a little outside the box approach to how we think about food. A much more integrated systems-based approach. And second, I will look at how this breakdown in food security and health is a global issue. And then from that, we can tease out the work we are doing with our Indigenous community. A little bit background, I came to this country as a young boy, 23, at age of 23, about 34 years ago. And so in many ways, my scientific upbringing is very in the American context. But yet, at the deep end of myself, my origins are in India. So philosophically, I'm very still, in all my thinking, still determined by my ancestral roots, which is India. And so this is very important because my dad, who was a medical doctor, it's his inspiration that's driving many of this research. And so one of the most fundamental advice he gave me when I left the shores of India is, it is only with humility that we can connect and find our humanity. And only then can we have our empathy, kindness, and compassion. So humanity is at a very critical juncture right now. Unless we have our humility to connect and bring out our empathy and compassion and kindness, then we are at that 6th extinction phase. And so we are products of our ecology. And so when we look at food system, we have to look at the ecology and the diversity of ecology, because the resilience of our ecosystem is built on diversity. So diversity paves way. So also in our food system, it is the diversity that is what's broken down. So what is food then? So that's my first point. So to make food is really is where our energy comes from, but really it comes from sunlight, solar energy. So, which is part of the larger cosmos, our cosmic energy. But let's tease it down to solar energy. So when we say carbohydrate, it is the solar energy that is a photon, energy that is brought into a chemical form, carbon being hydrated, carbohydrate. So it is this solar energy that finally is put into a chemical form. So once carbon is hydrated, we get carbohydrates. Then when nitrogen is added, we get amino acids and proteins. And then when the carbohydrates modified, we get lipids. So these are macronutrients, but they all come from the sun's energy, right? And then we have minerals and nutrition. So that's what we have defined as food. So it is this solar energy that is part of the ecosystem. And so when we look at the ecosystem, there are many components that we need to look at, but the common control points are many. But I like to pay attention to 3 fundamental concepts that will go down. So those are, one, the mind is very critical, but I don't have much time to go into that. So when we talk about the mind, the more fundamental link to our consciousness and beyond, to the larger world where our humanity has to come out in terms of bringing out empathy, kindness, and compassion, it is the mind that is the link. And it's the mind that's the link back into our time-space environment of the ecosystem. And so beyond the mind, 2 important points that I'd like to highlight is one is the maternal, all the maternal mother. And then another point that I like to bring out is a microbiome. So they may look very different, but they are related. So as we look at food, as we look how food is assimilated and as how it's shaped in the ecosystem, we, the human species that have come along and are now on this planet, we are closely dependent on the ecosystem. So this ecosystem is the key foundation to our food system. So that's a very important point. And I'd like to take you through this mitochondrial maternal link and the microbiome link as we look at food in a different way. And then I'll look at the global problems, and then we'll bring it, most of my talk will be on how we are working to look at the indigenous challenges here in America, but also in other parts of the world. And so in terms of the food diversity is key to combating our dietary chronic diseases, and I'll particularly show you the link to type 2 diabetes. So looking at these concepts, there are 4 fundamental needs of emerging global food security challenge. Traditionally, food security was just focused on the macronutrients and micronutrients, having enough to eat. So this is still a challenge. In a population that's 7.3 billion on the planet today, 1 billion of us still do not have enough to eat. Second, a more pressing problem is we have what's called a macronutrient overload, and most of the world today is going to die from non-communicable chronic disease. The word die is not a good word, but we are going to sorry. And so many of the health and wellness challenges, is a better way to say that, is going to come from non-communicable chronic diseases. So this is a bigger word. Also, please pardon me if I impulsively say something, and sometimes these words come. They are not. Language is funny, and English is my 5th language. So sometimes, and so the 4 major challenges that we in the Global Institute of Food Security are addressing. One is we still need to feed 1 billion people on this planet who are not getting enough calories. Second, we have an overload where excess calories, particularly highly refined carbohydrate burden, is increasing the non-communicable chronic disease rates globally. And this is a big challenge in the indigenous communities, more so than any other community. And so we'll come back to that and focus on. Third, we have to address both these challenges with climate change. And this climate change is largely due to 2 major carbon-based fossil fuels, which is coal, which is getting reduced, and second, the petroleums, which is 60% of the global energy basket. And so this is what's causing the global warming. So unless we go down to renewables, we are going towards this very continuous breakdown in the ecological system. And fourth, many of the antidotes. So for example, we focus only on how carbon is fixed and get our carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, minerals, and vitamins. But it's the oxygen that we breathe is where that energy is from the chemical is drawn out. And that happens in the mitochondria. Mitochondria is an organelle within each cell of our body. It is required for every function. And that's where the maternal link comes. It's transmitted to the child only through the mother. It's a maternal link. So that mitochondria is one of the central tenets of how we have to look at health. It's not just the assembly of food, but how we consume it and where the breakdown happens. So all the major breakdown in inflammation and other chronic disease are primarily starting with the breakdown in oxygen biology. Because what we breathe and is distributed through our vascular system is what's coupled to deriving the energy when glucose goes in or other nutrient goes through the bloodstream. It's the oxygen coupling that gets the energy out. And so unless the oxygen function is balanced, our disease burden will increase. And that's where the fourth is. We need to have adequate fruits and vegetables, and these fruits and vegetables have developed in their adaptive and reproductive phases the defense mechanism against oxygen malfunction. So it is these bioactive compounds that are there in these fruits and vegetables that we need to get into our diet. So it's not just macronutrients, it's not just the micronutrients, but these other compounds that are missing in the diet. So that missing, for example, when we say we should have 7 to 8 servings of fruits and vegetables a day, it makes sense. That's because we need to have this oxygen-fighting components, and that comes from the fruits and vegetables. So fruits and vegetables, which are highly perishable, are one of the key antidotes that we need to bring in. Their legumes and the beans, and therefore there are a lot of elements of fruits and vegetables in the indigenous community diet that we can bring back, including the Three Sisters and their other components as well. So these four are the key facets where the global challenges are. There are sub-challenges, but these are broad categories. So if you look at our food today, there are 3 important missing pieces. One is we have not considered the role of oxygen. That is where major non-communicable chronic diseases are emerging. Just like one is diabetes, and onward it goes to cardiovascular breakdown, cancers. All these are non-communicable preventable disease that is largely coming from the ecosystem breakdown and largely coming from the food systems breakdown and the environmental breakdown. And second, many of the whole food profiles, we strip them away during processing. So these oxygen fighting and other cofactors, we stripped away as we process food and try to preserve them. So this whole food profile these protective elements need to be brought back. And number 3, very important, we are product of our ancient microbiome that's part of us. So this microbiome that's transmitted through the mother, which also maternal mitochondrial function that's transmitted through the mother. It comes from our ancient past, and that ancient past is still with us. And it's the mother that transmits this microbiome to the child, and then this microbiome is built. So we are now more clearly understanding this dietary component that support the microbiome we need to consume. For example, you're eating the lovely wild rice. They have amazing amount of microbiome supporting components. Okay. So that's the third. So these are the missing pieces. So we need to connect them. We not just look at the macronutrients and micronutrients, but also look at these missing pieces in our diet, the oxygen fighting, the mitochondrial supporting, and the microbiome supporting. Both these mitochondrial supporting and microbiome supporting, they are the key maternal driven factors that goes from the mother to the child. So this maternal bonding with the child is very fundamental as we correct the food system and what we feed, both at the maternal stage during the pre-birth stage at every trimester, but also beyond that. We need to look at this continuum of the microbiome and how the mitochondria is protected. So these 2 fundamental concepts have to be bought in. And then when we look at deeper into the overall ecosystem, At every facet, from soil health to animal health to human health, the microbiome is central to the viability of the ecosystem. The resilience, the diversity that's there, and the resilience is built from this ancient microbiome that still has to be with us. We should not sort of knock that away. And in fact, we're doing that both at many levels, by the kind of lifestyle, but the kind of food system that we consume, this narrow base of food system. So we need to widen that, because this mitochondrial function, the two maternal mitochondrial function and the microbiome function has to be sustained. So this is fundamental. So these are some basic rules that we need to bring back into our diet. So diet-linked improvement of gut microbiome and overall health is very central. So we need a diverse array of diet, because nature has built the same tools for different species. And so as we get this diverse array, we get those benefits. So we need to look at that, and each ecology developed its own rules and ecosystem to build that up. So each ecosystem should be preserved. So because you're built from that ecosystem. So if you're building from that ecosystem, then your diet should come from the ecosystem by and large. So when that's disrupted, we have many problems. So that's really also a global problem. And I saw, in addition to the mitochondria, in addition to the microbiome, the mitochondria, it's an organelle in every cell of our body. And that is where the energy is, the food that we eat, the energy is obtained. It's only when the coupling with the oxygen, how we breathe, that's what gets the energy out and refurbishes the physiology. And then when that system is broken, then we'll run into trouble. So nowadays, all drug treatments are to some structure function breakdown when it's all the way totally broken down. So we should catch it much earlier at the preventive stage. That's where the oxygen function and the food that we eat needs to be coupled in a harmonious way. And so the more we look into the diversity of nature, that can support that. So oxygen biology is very central. So when I mean by oxygen biology, it is what we breathe and how that couples with the mitochondria to get energy. So this is fundamental function. This is the fundamental role. So this is where our diet needs to be coupled. Okay, so all calories are not equal. Fructose is different because it finally goes through as glucose. So how glucose is coupled to the mitochondrial function. So we may base our 2,000 calories on a calorimeter. We burn it on a calorimeter and say, oh, we need 2,000 calories. But our mitochondria is where all that energy is drawn out. It's very different. It's a compartmentalized system within a cell. And it's very different from brain cell to heart cells to all other cells. So this role of oxygen biology and protecting the maternal-driven mitochondria is one of the central tenets to bring back these protective elements into our food system. So this is I'm trying to simplify as much. So within this context, role of plant compounds is very central. And why is that? Plants, in every facet of stress and reproductive phases in the open environment, had to deal with the same oxygen biology. So they developed these protective elements. So when we get that in our diet, we get these protective functions. So in this high calorie, high refined sugar environment that we live in, we are the mitochondria is on pressure all the time, on overdrive. Imagine if your car is 100,000 miles that has to run over 10 years. Imagine if you just, 1 year you run the whole thing, So your system will break down. The same way, as we overload our calories, we are putting pressure on the mitochondria to do overwork. So it is bound to fail. So the epigenetic changes take place. It had to readjust, initially readjust by putting the carbohydrate into fat cells, and then the hormonal balance breaks down. So one by one, they move down from diabetes to cardiovascular disease, later in stages autoimmune disease or arthritis. So one by one, different organelles and tissues start to break down. But they all start at the mitochondrial protective layer. So this organelle that we inherited from our mother, it directly goes through the mother. So this oxygen malfunction in a high-calorie, refined sugar diet is, and plus, if the air we breathe is contaminating that oxygen that's so precious, then we are in this whole system, and the hormones associated with it also break down. And therefore, if you look at the role of plants, one of those compounds like the phenolic compounds, which are there for protection, and they're there for protection for many different protective roles of the plant in the open environment. So if we can capture that, we can not only build a resilient food system, even with climate change, but also the protective elements can be good in our diet. So the more diverse food system that we look at, we can find more of these protective compounds. So the more diversity, the better choices we have in trying to get these protective. So diversity, there are many choices in nature. So the more of those choices we bring into our diet, the better off we are. So that's what I mean by diversity. See, at the metabolic level, they're so central. In nature, nature is amazing. It's so beautiful. And if we can just go back to Mother Nature, we can tease out those elements into our diet and bring it back into our diet. And therefore, all my students, if they come from whichever part of the world they come from, I tell them, no, you should work only on your foods. So you use all these common, nice biochemistry, but then take it back and rebuild your local food system. Because every ecology was developed for those people. And the more we can rationalize these common chemistry into those local ecologies, the better off we are. And therefore, we have studied many species based on their cultural relevance, and we are finding common threads of the science, but then how they apply has their own deep history and knowledge that we should preserve. There was a reason why each community developed with their own set of governing rules, the cultural framework. So all this can be rationalized scientifically as well. And so if you go further, forget the chemistry, but there are enough of these common compounds, even though there's an Arctic plant versus a tropical plant, some of these common chemistries are same because they're still dealing with that 19% oxygen that's common to all of us. And we're still dealing with the 0.35% carbon dioxide, which is, of course, with global warming increasing, but we're still dealing with the same carbon dioxide. The water is the same. So the basic elements are same all over the planet as long as we live on this earth, right? So these compounds are there. So we have looked at many compounds that are these common control points to govern the function of plants and how those plants, when it comes into our diet, can be protective for us. So that's a very fundamental link. And so as we go, so this is summarizing many years of work. So what we are seeing in plants is when they are putting out these protective functions, they use their metabolism in a very unique way. And then when we get those compounds and eat them, we get those protections as well. So the logic of plant metabolism has parallels because in plants, they also have the mitochondria, but they're autotrophic. They can directly take the sun's energy and make carbohydrates, while we have to eat them through seeds or leaves or different forms that we consume every day. So what we have found in many species across different cultures, many students from 20, 30 countries, each doing their own each working with their own species. And now we have collaborations. We try to give these tools out to the different, many of my students who have gone back to their countries. And so they are building their own food system with this logic. And so let's go in, how do we apply this? This is all good as I lay out the science, but now how does it make sense to one of the biggest, most rapidly growing non-communicable chronic disease on the planet? And it's particularly affecting the indigenous communities globally, and much so indigenous communities here in the United States. So I need not give you all the statistics, but let's look at the solutions. And therefore, we are looking at type 2 diabetes, where 90% is adult onset. That means the insulin system has not yet broken down. Only 10% or less is where the insulin production is, the pancreas does not make the insulin. But 90% of our type 2 diabetes is adult onset. At some point, it can also, where the insulin system also can break down in type 2 diabetics. But 80% is preventable, and this largely goes to the diet that we consume. And today, the prognosis is not so good. It is suggested that by 2030, we'll have 400 million on this planet with type 2 diabetes, but now it's worse. It could be 600 million by 2030. So it's going at much more rapid rate than it was projected. So the global costs are huge. And many of the antidotes, the drug antidotes that like acrobose or many of these digestive inhibitors that can slow down the glucose, many of those antidotes can be found in plant systems because plants have developed these feedback loops and control mechanisms to control their own sugar metabolism as they distribute. So many of those compounds, we can find the analogs of what there are in the drug. So it's better we get them in the diet at a very early stage so that the preventable solutions can be put in place much earlier, not when the disease progresses midway through. So type 2 diabetes is preventable as long as we control the glycemic load, and the more we take a whole range of fruits and vegetables that are antidote to the oxygen malfunction, and within that we can also find these carbohydrate modulating compounds. So in our laboratory, from every culture, we can find the inhibitors of glycemic control in food system. We can find it in our 3 sisters. We can find it in wild rice. We can find it in many, many foods, and I'll give you some of the results soon. So in terms of diabetes, the glucose control is central, but later at a later stage, beta cell function associated with the insulin function, it also breaks down. And ultimately, there's oxidative breakdown that affects the eye and the kidney issues and wound healing issues. So these are much later stages. And of course, we have the macrovascular complication of high blood pressure as the diabetics go into cardiovascular stages. So therefore, they're largely result of the inexpensive refined calories that we have been burdened globally with, and more so, this burden is higher in the indigenous communities. And if you look at that, I won't stay on this slide because you know all of this. The health disparities are very severe in the indigenous communities, and more so in the Great Plains, the disparities is even worse. I won't go into that. These are counterintuitive. And this is particularly difficult from the pregnancy to the child. So that's where you're predisposing your child right from the beginning. So this is a very central stage where diet intervention is very central to not only control the gestational diabetes, but also to help manage this early for the child. Okay, so the maternal inheritance and the microbiome interlinks, all these are very central and critical. So this is a very important element. So therefore, what do we do? And the good news is we have all the tools within our communities, and we need to bring them back. And even though we have lost our ecology. I won't go into the politics and the difficulties, but we need to bring back. Clearly, when we look at our 3 sisters and start looking at these biochemical indicators, they are loaded with these glycemic control, redox control. So they are there already. We do not have to go into these last stage drugs to make our solutions. They are there. So here, for example, one of my students in 2007, we published health benefits of traditional corn, bean, pumpkin. And when we see this, it has loaded with glycemic control compounds. And similarly, we looked at one of my students from Peru. I'm actually going this afternoon to Peru. So even there, we could, they're loaded with many of these glycemic control compounds. So what we have now done is we've taken all of these tools and then we are saying, okay, how do we bring back a traditional garden? Or in addition to that, can we build other diversity that's available within us? Because we have lost all of our overall, many of our traditional tools. But can we bring some of the scientific logic and bring some of the indigenous crops back? And if so, what would it look like? And what kind of pumpkins, what kind of corn, what kind of beans will fit into this? And so we have been working on this at many levels, and we are particularly working with here in Shakopee with the Indigenous Peoples Task Force, and we are looking at how we can integrate squash, many of the tradition by food processing, wild rice. One of my PhD students is working. He's from Ojibwe, so he's working on the wild rice. Likewise, we are looking at the Indigi baby food design by using many of the traditional food system. As I told you, maternal and child health are very central. So how can we bring these protective compounds into this design? And likewise, what else can we bring in within this framework? So it's very exciting that there are many, many antidotes that we can get from our local ecology. And there are other exciting, so we're also looking at some of the indigenous agriculture methods. How could they be useful in trying to build up these antidotes for our health? Okay, so very quickly, I have just a few more slides. So this is some of our strategies, how we are going to build this. Is from all the way to soil health to human health, including to making it viable within communities. Likewise, the future drag is strategies to build research initiative, both including integrating the market initiatives, so that each community is sustainable and economically viable as well for their community. And another very important point is what we are finding is many of the hardy, resilient crop species, they're also more suitable for climate resilience. So what's good for human health is also relevant as we adapt these new species for managing the climate change that's emerging, where the extremes are going to be high. We're going to have more colder days and more warmer days. So we have to switch some of these carbohydrates to making the crops more resilient to survive these extremes. And what is exciting is many of the compounds that they produce for this resilience, they're also relevant for our health. Okay. So with this platform, the microbiome and the mitochondrial platform, which is centrally maternal health-driven platforms, so they are very central. So we have all the way from soil health to human health. So we take this discovery engine to every community. It's open source. So we are part of humanity. So that's where I think. So this should be available to everybody. So we go to every community, look at it from their own local perspective, and try to integrate this. And in many ways, I learn more than what we give them. So we are also learning in the process to improve the system. And so that's my last slide. So I thank you for your attention. So we need to look at the ecology as the foundation and the diversity as the foundation, from which we can then add the metabolic and the good biochemistry to start teasing out this local diversity around the world and bring it back to bring health and wellness to our communities. And also not just health and wellness, but the larger well-being from the economic system to every other well-being indicators. So I appreciate your time, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions.